Well, yesterday we talked about the purpose of God and the conformity of God, if you will. That God is in the process of using circumstances in your life to bring your life into conformity to His will. Most of us are familiar with the statement by Isaiah where he said that God is the potter and we are the clay. And the idea with a potter is that he takes something out of the earth which has no obvious or inherent value, and by watering it and molding it and screeding it and getting all the rocks and the pebbles out, then he begins to take that, throw it on the wheel, and to shape it until it begins to take the form he wants it to have. Well, when we talk about the trials of the day-to-day Christian life, what God is really doing, he's kind of trying to screed out all the things that shouldn't be there. Those little rocks and pebbles and other obstructions that are in our life that are keeping us from being usable, if you will. He's in the process of working to remove those things. And those are called our testings and our trials. That doesn't mean that all trials or all testings are from God. I mean, sometimes we put ourselves in situations, and maybe that in itself is part of the learning process, that we learn not to rebel against the Lord because of the consequences that come. But it's not to despair over that when you find yourself failing in some way, because those are all part of that learning grid that we're on, that trajectory that our life has, that God is working constantly, regularly, consistently trying to take out of our lives things that are keeping us from being usable and available, so that he can make us into a vessel for his glory, is the way that Paul put it. And that's what he says here in verse 12 as well in chapter 1 of Ephesians. He says that he's doing all the things he's doing in our life in order that we who were first to hope in Christ might be for the praise of his glory. Now, this is really where a point of conflict arises for many of us, because let's be honest, that narcissistic disposition of our sinful human nature really is pretty committed to doing things that will lead to our glory. In fact, I love, and I've shared this before, but I think it's always been such a constant reminder to me in my life, is that Billy Graham once said there are three things that a man of God should never touch. And one, he said, should never touch the gold, he should never touch the gals, and should never touch the glory. Now, to be honest, I found that every man I've ever known who ended up touching the glory first, or touching the gals and the gold, began by touching the glory. That's the real downfall. When we begin to give ourselves permission, or think we have a right to something, or even begin to demand something, that we get caught up in our own self-esteem. You know, it's funny because I've never seen women going up to homeless men who are dirty and unclean and addicted and falling apart and wanting to develop a relationship with them or become interested and spend time with them, because they recognize that, well, they're kind of like, my t-shirt, which puts it really well. They're talentless, and there's not an attraction there. And yet, if you take that same man and you clean him up and give him a nice haircut and put him a nice set of clothing on him and spray him with foo-foo water and all the things, and put him in a setting where suddenly he looks successful and powerful, those women will be attracted to him. And that's the thing I find in ministry, is that oftentimes women will look at, well, in this case, sometimes men too, will look at men who are successful and effective in ministry, and they'll be attracted to them for the wrong reasons. And they begin to flatter and say nice things and lift you up. And I think as one Christian leader put it so well, he said, flattery will never hurt you unless you suck it in. And that's the thing, is that flattery has a toxic vapor, so that if you suck it in, you take it in and begin to breathe it, it will begin to corrupt the entire core of your character. And so one of the things we have to understand is that the only one that we should be concerned with getting the glory is God. that we always have to step back and say, am I guilty of touching the glory? Am I guilty of thinking of myself more highly than I ought to think, is how Paul expressed it to Romans. Am I thinking soberly with right judgment? In other words, or another way of putting it, he says, do I have an intoxicated view of myself? We all understand, I think, the idea of intoxication. It distorts our thinking. It's interesting because when people are intoxicated, unattractive people, for reasons that are hard to explain, become more attractive. And as a result, we're drawn to things that if we were sober-minded, we wouldn't think twice about. And so the bottom line is that we're drawn away because we have been led astray in our thinking. Our eyes, Paul said, have been blinded by the enemy, and we're no longer walking or acting like people who are sober, but there's kind of a social arrogance about us, that somehow we think that we're special, that we have something to offer. One of my elders for early ministry made an important point to me. He said, every one of us is like putting a finger in a glass of water. It may displace the space when we put our finger into it, but you pull the finger out and the water will just fill in that space again as if you had never been there. And I thought that's really a healthy way of looking at it, in a sense, not the idea that what I do doesn't matter. But I cannot allow myself to get in that place where I think that somehow there's a wondrous world-changing aspect of who we are. Quite honestly, God has blessed me and given the opportunity to teach the Word, and I think that He's blessed it to the point where it helps people, and people would say, well, yeah, that's good. But the thing I understand is, without God, there's nothing good. As one guy put it really well, and unfortunately didn't follow his own advice, but it was good advice nonetheless. He said, if it's good, it's Jesus, and if it's bad, it's me. And I think that's the thing we need to realize. And whenever we do something that is really good, we see God using us in some particular way, and we feel that sense of fulfillment and gratification. We should be very careful at that moment to simply turn and say, God, I thank you for giving me the opportunity and the capacity to do what I just did. Don't let me be tempted by touching the glory and saying somehow, look what I have done. Remember the story of Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel, where he looked over the parapet of his palace and he said, is this not great Babylon which I have built? Well, by every human standard, Babylon at that time was great. It was an amazing place. He had built the largest, most powerful empire in the world, and certainly the wealthiest, and it showed in all of the things that he built and the places where he lived, and by the garments he wore and the harem he had and all this kind of stuff. People were bowing and scraping all around him. He considered himself a great man. The problem was when he began to hear that flattery, he sucked it in and it became toxic, and God brought judgment upon him. And that's what I think is important for us always to be reminded, that our purpose in being blessed by God is that we might live in a way that brings praise to His glory. That it's directing people's attention to Him. My pastor, another way he used to put it, he said, my desire is to be so transparent that when people look at me, they only see Jesus. And that transparency really ties into kind of an honesty, that we're not pretending to be something we're not or better than what we are. We're just being honest. Well, I would simply say that the honest truth is, if I do something good, it's Jesus. And when I do something bad, it's me. I have to take the ownership and confess it as my sin. And as long as we do that, we'll end up being in that place where God will say, I can trust you, because you're humble enough to own the truth about yourself, and you're available enough to let me show my power through you without touching it and making out as if it was you. So anyway, we'll continue on with our next blessing, where we'll talk about, I think, one of the most wonderful things about being really sealed. That's number 8 in our series, sealed in Christ. And what does that mean? And why should that make me feel really good? God bless you, and go in His grace.